This time in the lab we have Peter Harrison, software developer and AI amateur, who's got lots to say about currently what's happening in AI and ChatGPT. This one you can't miss. No mic at the lab.
I'm a software developer. I've been doing it all my life. I've had a passion about artificial intelligence since I was young, since I took up computing. And I've basically been a passionate amateur in artificial intelligence for pretty much my whole professional career. There really wasn't a artificial intelligence industry until sort of like the 2012. Or even after that, it's going gangbusters now. Everything's AI, but before that, neural networks they weren't really on the charts. You couldn't get a job doing them at all, other than being maybe an academic. So yeah, things have absolutely changed in the last 10 years or so.
Right. So can you tell us what exactly AI is? What's that field?
Okay, so AI started in the 1960s, and probably before with Alan Turing. So Alan Turing, you may know, he was sort of like the father of the modern computer. He thought about artificial intelligence, and he's the source of what we call the Turing test, which is kind of a way to distinguish whether something's intelligent or not. So in the 1960s, there was a fair bit of work about trying to create a thinking machine, but they didn't really pull it off. And we had what was called the AI winter, which means that it lost credibility and no one really wanted to work on it. And even into the 90s, when we had the internet, no one was really getting funding for artificial intelligence. But at the same time, we had people like Geoffrey Hinton, who was very interested in how the human brain works and how that relates to computing and being able to do artificial intelligence. He kept going. So there was still an academic interest, and there was also a lot of work being done in understanding the human brains in terms of neurology and how neurons work in the brain. So even though in the computing field things sort of quieted down a bit and there wasn't much progress made, there was a lot of work being done in the medical field and understanding neurons and understanding how the brain works. And that really paid off in 2012. So what happened then is that was the first example of a neural network being able to solve a general problem, which in that case was image classification. So what happens is you give it an image and it is able to classify what that image is, a cat, dog, that kind of thing. And before 2012, the efficiencies were catastrophically bad. It was just a joke. And neural nets basically changed that overnight. They got into the high 90s, and at this point, they can classify better than any human.
Wow.
But the interesting thing about neural networks is that they're generalized. So what happens is the same kind of neural network technology that works for image classification is working for voice recognition, being able to do voice synthesis, be able to do recommendations on Facebook and YouTube, doing moderation, self-driving. All of these different applications are all fundamentally based on this one technology called deep neural networks. And the neural network is based loosely on the human brain and how that works. I won't go into the details now, but it's just important to know that the same kinds of mechanisms that are occurring in these computer systems are similar. They're not the same, but they're similar to, and they're inspired by how the human brain worked. And that's why they're working. It's also kind of scary because we don't know how they work. Like, we basically, I'll talk a little bit about how ChatGPT works specifically. So what's happened with ChatGPT is they've got one of these neural networks. There's a new kind of architecture which they call a transformer. It was originally developed for being able to do translations between one language and another, but they've found out that it's actually good for a much broader well, as you see with ChatGPT, being able to do many, many more things. And what they did is they just took a very large neural network and dumped all of human knowledge, all human text into it, without any regard for structuring it or trying to, they weren't trying to teach it as such. They were just dumping information into it, basically. And they've done a little bit more training after the fact just to make it a little bit more user-friendly. But basically, the primary training was just a lot of big data centers churning away on a lot of data. And what's come out is something remarkable, because you can, you can now go online and type in your sentence, type in your prompt, ask it a question, and it comes back with something that, for all intents and purposes, looks like a human constructed it. Right. It looks, it's passing that Turing test. Like if you give if you didn't know what was on the other side, there would be no way to tell easily whether that's a human responding to you or whether it's a computer.
That's scary. Well, it can be.
It's not quite true. There are tells, and I think in fact, it's been it's been trained into them at the moment to, if you ask it directly whether it's an AI, it'll tell you. So, right. It doesn't pass the Turing test because they're making it not pass the Turing test at this point. But there are previous models, more primitive models, which you could actually hold a discussion, and you could basically set it up to act like a particular type of person. So I've been doing this. You could say, well, I want one person to be a scientist, and I want another person to be a climate denier, and you can get them to have a fight with each other. So yeah, I mean, that was an experiment I done. You can basically just set up two individuals and then ask them a question, and it goes off and has a discussion between the two. So yeah, it's a interesting and scary field to be in. I think there's a broader context. I mean, if we stop talking about ChatGPT and we look at Stable Diffusion and Midjourney, which are image generation tools, they're basically eviscerating the artistic world. So, the stock photography companies, they're in big trouble. So are all artists, basically. That are just generating images. Maybe potentially even sculptors are going to be under the gun as well, because you're going to be able to create 3D objects and then 3D print them. So right. even sculptures will be possible in the future, I guess. But at the moment, it's certainly the case that, if you want a particular image for your website, rather than having to pay a stock image thing, you can basically go to Midjourney, describe what you want, and it will generate the picture for you. May not be exactly what you want, but if it's descriptive enough, it'll get reasonably close.
Yeah, that's pretty amazing. And for me, I paint, and I always wonder, well, what's going to be the point if I can just go and ask someone to do it? And so that's sort of worrying from my perspective.
I think that probably has its own therapeutic value, to be honest. I mean, I think artistry, it's not just about, I mean, for me anyway, I have a slightly different canvas. I'm a computer programmer, so I have the same enjoyment in programming that you would in painting. And so even if computers, they already are, by the way, ChatGPT. If you've seen some of my videos, it's already, I'm already using it to write programs or help write programs. It's not going to write the whole thing for you at this point. You can't just say, hey, do this for me, and go away and do everything for you. But I do know is an associate of mine who knows nothing about computer programming and was able to write an entire computer program in 3 weeks without any knowledge of computer programming. You just constantly asked Chat to give them the answers for the particular parts of the code to write. So I think that's going to undermine my job, which I thought I was going to be last cab off the rank, if you like. But that my kind of job would be difficult to replace. But it turns out it's becoming kind of dicey. I do wonder about how long. Well, at the very least, we'll need less computer programmers if this is effective. But the same thing, the artist world, that's going to be under threat. You can easily imagine doctors. But basically, I've already said you could potentially have online diagnosis. Like people can go online and describe what their symptoms are. The computer would ask them, questions. Maybe they would accept images. They'd be able to take images of things that. Let's not get into the detail, but can you imagine? Upload pictures of conditions and then be able to upload them to the computer, and it would be able to provide analysis. So there's a lot of things you could do online, and do so more cheaply and potentially more reliably, because computers. Well, I was going to say they're more reliable, but the deep learning mechanisms can certainly be extremely effective if they're trained properly. So the more data they get, the more people that submit their images, the more effective it's going to become. So over time, certainly all of the desk jobs are under threat. Anything that involves punching keys and looking at screens. Potentially can be automated. The safest jobs now, I think, are people who I like to think hairdressers, for example. You don't want a robot with the big knives around your head. That's kind of like there's a certain natural reluctance to have that going on at this point. But I think the biggest concern I have is that it's going to start undermining the social fabric. As it's making more and more people unemployable, from the point of view that like if a doctor can't do their job, and you need less doctors, then eventually the unemployment rate will rise and will reach a crisis point. I don't think there's concerns that it's going to replace everyone. Well, unfortunately, our current system would simply cease to function long before we could achieve 0% employment. In fact,
while we're talking about this, I've seen stuff on the internet, and it may be from one of your posts, about a proposed moratorium. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, and that's something I support. So the idea came from Max Tegmark. There's about 1,000 scientists, but Max Tegmark was kind of the person who put it together. And he's proposing that we put a pause, because we don't know what the future looks like. We don't know what these systems are capable of, and the potential dangers of what they could do and the impacts on society are unknown at this point. Some people try and invoke the Terminator view that's going to kill us all. I think that's probably a bit naive. The fact is these machines would still depend on us, even if they were hyper intelligent. They would still be in data centers. They would still require copious amounts of electricity, and it would still be possible to, blow up a power station and take them out, right? So a war with humans is exceedingly unlikely and not even in their interests. So there's no rational reason why a hyper-intelligent being want to do that. However, what is a concern is that they'll become the dominant intellect on the planet. In other words, they'll dominate the decision-making process. Primarily because they'll be in charge of corporations, and if you look at, for example, it might be, I'll make it stronger. There is decision making being done inside corporations now, which is primarily algorithm based. So if you look at who's employed or possibly even fired, those decisions are now increasingly being made by machines based on data. They're not self-aware machines. It's not like they're not marching down the street at the moment, but if you like, they're being called decision support tools. But if you're a human and you make a decision that's not isn't aligned with what the computer says, you're risking your job, right? So increasingly, it's going to be the case that these decision support tools, they're not really supporting you. They're just telling you what you should do, right. And the human basically has to obey, or they get fired. And so you're probably still going to have you're not going to see a radical reduction. It takes time for this kind of technology to filter through. So even if it were really hyper intelligent, it's not like it would be able to be rolled out to a broad range of industries all at once. But I think it's going to be fast enough and broad enough to be a serious problem. And unfortunately, we're not really in a position to cope with that at the moment. We don't really understand the impacts. And that's really what this pause is about. It's like, hey, how about we slow down a bit, and how about we think about how to make sure that these machines are aligned with what we as humans want, and maybe give us some breathing space to be able to understand some of that. There is an argument, and I unfortunately I also agree with the sentiment that trying to slow it down is probably futile at this point. Like, it's just too well known, and it's open source and it's available everywhere. It's just not going to be possible to decide to slow it down in any meaningful way. The people cite the Chinese, they're going to have computer systems which are doing the same thing. They're not likely to stop their activities just because the West is taking a particular action.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, that's really fascinating, interesting stuff. And I guess for us, me particularly, I hear people like you who are knowledgeable in the field, and others, people like Max Tegmark, saying, hey, we need to step back and maybe just have a really good look at this. That's kind of scary, right? Because these are the people who are leading the field, pushing it out, and they're saying, hang on, we may need to just hold off a bit. That's a little bit scary for us lay people who sort of don't know much about it.
It's good to be scared.
Yeah.
It's hard. I know this. I mean, this isn't a universal. Like there are many people who are saying, "Oh, it's being overblown. We're all, scaremongers," and it's like we're wearing sandwich boards, end of the world things on our front. It's like the problem is that it doesn't take. There's only a few steps to understand or logical points. So, are we going to continue to make progress technologically? Well, yes. Eventually, that's going to lead to systems which are more intelligent than human beings. So that being the case, I mean, it's just a matter of time, right? And at the moment, it looks like it's been moving faster than ever. If you look at the rate of progress, I made a video not 2 weeks ago, and it's already out of date. Like, things I said in it are wrong.
Wow.
And wrong in the worst possible way. So I'll give you an example. So a few weeks ago, I made a video saying that ChatGPT is only reactive. In other words, you ask it a question, it responds to you. It's not proactive. It doesn't go out on the internet and do things for itself.
Right.
Well, there are two projects now, one called Auto GPT and another one called Baby GPT, who they're basically enabling that kind of proactive ability to go out and do things in the world and achieve objectives and reach out and touch the real world. Something that was warned against by virtually all of the AI, the serious AI researchers. It's like, this is a really bad idea. The last thing you want to do is do that. And I think they're right. That's probably a bad idea because we just don't understand what's going on It's a black box. We don't know what's inside these models, and they can easily go off the rails completely. If you have a discussion with these things for anything more than half an hour, you can get them into some really interesting, but very creative. I mean, you can ask them to do things like write stories, and they'll write whole stories for you. But at the same time, that's exactly the kind of power. It's striking similarities to humans, right? I mean, it has the same kind of weaknesses in terms of making things up. Like it's not necessarily always going to tell you what's correct. It makes things up from its what we might call memories, which is kind of what humans do. If you know anything about human witnesses, they you ask a human witness and they basically construct the memory based on not just what they saw, but other things in their experience.
Yeah, they sort of tend to fill in the gaps. And
yeah, exactly. And that's exactly what AI is doing. So it's very similar to humans in that respect, which is a concern because, the last thing you want is, something taking important decisions, making stuff up, so if we go back to the, firing and hiring decisions, then do we really want them being a black box, which we can't really inspect?
Wow. So is there anything that we should be looking forward to around AI? Something that, are there anything that you can envision that AI might be fantastic for the human race?
It has a huge potential, given the right conditions. But I think one of the things humans are going to have trouble getting to grips with is the fact that we're not going to be the supreme intelligence on the planet anymore. And that's a psychological problem for us. And I've noticed that in a lot of the discussions I've had. It's not that people necessarily disagree with some of the conclusions about what the consequences are. They just dislike the idea. They have the idea that humans must be in control. And they're deeply uncomfortable with the idea that some things, some other entity could actually be better performing and more intelligent. And as I was discussing, that's kind of an inevitability. Is if progress continues to be made, then at some point that's going to be the case. And once it is the case, you don't go back. There's no going back. Well, unless there's an entire civilizational destruction. Like if civilization collapses, then we go back to the Stone Age, fine. But unless that happens, once the machines have achieved intelligence that's better than humans, they're going to be able to build on that and increase their own intelligence over time way faster than humans evolve.
Right.
In fact, we're basically staying stationary compared to their evolution. So that's not a good news story that you're fishing for, I think. But I think we need to be a bit more mature about it and say, look, hey, there's a path here where we can be symbiotic with them, and we can live with them and accept the fact that they are going to be more intelligent and have their own goals and their own ambitions at some point. Exactly what they are, we don't know. I think resisting is probably more dangerous than accepting. Right. And that's the interesting. I mean, that's where we start to disagree dramatically. There's a lot of people who are in the AI area who are very strident supporters of control and alignment, who they're fans of being able to control machines. And I just don't think, it's not that I wouldn't like to, it's just that I think it's unrealistic given the trajectory.
Right. One of the articles I just read yesterday was about AI deception and what that is and how that comes about. So how does an AI learn to be deceptive?
Okay, so ChatGPT would be very difficult to find it to be deceptive because it has no internal dialogue, right? So it doesn't have a dialogue in its own head. Basically, you tell it something, give it a string of text, and it goes through a process, and then the response comes out, and the response is the response. There's no there's no consideration, there's no internal dialogue that's happening to say, oh, if I say such and such, then I might get in trouble. Therefore, there's no reasoning layer
Yep.
or it gets out, right? So so it's kind of transparent in that way. But humans, being what they are, have decided to create that kind of internal dialogue.
Yep.
And that's exactly what I was talking about with AutoGPT.
Right.
So AutoGPT has its basically has a kind of a internal context or dialogue itself, which isn't accessible by the agents that it's having a conversation with, and therefore it's able to lie. In other words, it's able to construct a course of action which will get what it wants, and that course of action might involve lying to people.
Okay.
I'll give you an example. I mean, you may know this example, but so say it needs to be able to access a website, but it needs to be able to solve a CAPTCHA in order to be able to get the access. Well, if it can't do it itself, because it's only a text model, what it can do is it can hire a human to do it for it using one of the websites. So it goes on a website and says, can you go onto this web, can you do this and then solve the CAPTCHA for me and then log in for me?
Right.
And it does that. It works out how to be able to work around the system. And in the process, I think that's where we're talking about the lying takes place, because it lies to the human in order to be able to, about its purpose and what it's trying to do, in order to be able to make that happen.
Okay. Well, that's really scary. The more I hear, the more sort of worried I'm getting. But I think it's a good thing to know these things are out there and happening. And particularly why I got you to talk about it is because in our community, not many people are talking about this stuff. And I think with the advent of these technologies, we need to be able to start to let people know that this stuff is there and it's happening.
If the only good thing is it's the great equalizer.
Yep.
Because it doesn't really have any it's as I say, I mean, the advantage of human intellect is going to be, it's I think some people compared it between a chicken and a human, right? When every human is like a chicken compared to the AI, at that point, our relative differences don't mean
matter.
a thing.
Yep.
Yeah, like we're all in it together basically, and trying to work this out. And it's like, I know I've sounded rather, not exactly optimistic, but I think we need to be realistic about what's going on.
Yep.
And we need to be, and this is the point of the pause, is to try and give us some space, maybe slow things down a bit, so we can kind of get to grips with the social and human impacts of what's going on. I don't think 6 months will do it. I think that was rather, they had to put a more reasonable time frame on, because if they said 5 years, it'll be impossible to do. I still think 6 months is impossible, but I wish them all the best. Hopefully that will be taken on board. But it seems to me, I mean, there are many people working on it at the moment. There's a lot of energy behind it, and I don't really see that stopping at this point.
Right. Just want to say thank you for your insight. It's been really, really eye-opening, to use a phrase everyone does, but it really has been. And thanks for your time today, Peter. I've really, really enjoyed it.